Welcome to Rocket Ship, the home of epic React Native content. I'm Simon Grimm, creator of galaxies.dev and also today's host of the show, because we got a solo show. We're gonna do a quick Q&A episode. I asked for questions on X and LinkedIn. I got a long list of questions and we're gonna cover topics from Expo to the future of React Native to component to EAS. There are really tons of great questions that you submitted. So thanks for submitting all of them and let's dive straight into them. First one is from David. What is your top 3 of third-party libraries you use all the time? Thank you, David. David was also, I think, probably one of the first guests here on the Rocket Ship podcast. So go back in the episodes, check out that episode with David Lilliet. My top 3, I think number 1 is Reanimated, although I kind of see it as like a core of React Native Expo projects because it's like usually installed at this point all the time. So Reanimated. Then I really love to use the Gore home bottom sheet, and it just came out with version 5, which actually has web support, so pretty cool news. And the third library is probably, you might not have heard about it. It's called Zeego from Fernando Rojo, who's also on the podcast. It's used for context menus, these overlay menus. When you use Force Touch on iOS, you can get beautiful stuff done with Zeego. So check out those 3. Brian wants to know, is it reliable to use just JavaScript instead of TypeScript on mobile development? Well, yes, you can do, but why would you? I don't know. At this point, I thought we'd all agree that TypeScript is a good idea. So yeah, I think you can still use JavaScript, although I actually haven't seen it being used like that. So I honestly don't know. Yeah, it's reliable. I mean, you make more mistakes yourself, so you become more unreliable if you use JavaScript. Alex, which EAS secrets and environments? Okay, so the question is, can you use different secrets and for different environments with EAS? And actually the answer is yes. There's a cool guide. I will put all the links in the show notes, as always, from Expo about environment variables in EAS builds. And it turns out you can not only have your .env file, so .env production, .env something, or .env local, but you can also put them right into your app.json. And in your app.json, you can actually put them under build, production, or test, or whatever environment you got. So by doing this, EAS knows about it and can make the relation between the different environments in which you want to use different keys. Next question comes from Hamza and Jorge. They kind of had a similar question about best practices for security and handling secret keys. Now, this one is an interesting one. A couple of months ago, maybe even a year ago, I did a video in which I took applications, I downloaded them from my phone to my computer, and I did some reverse engineering, and I was able to extract some keys from them, specifically secret keys to APIs. Now, how is that possible? Well, if you put secret keys to your app into your TypeScript files, they will be part of the bundle, and other people will be able, with enough criminal energy, to recompile or decompile your application and get to those keys. So don't put them as clear text in your app. Now, you might think, I have a .env file in my React Native project. I will put my OpenAI secret key in there. Well, that is also not a really smart idea, because usually what you do is you will put something like Expo public my key in front of that key, and that means that Expo during the build process or compile process will actually inline those keys. So same topic as before, your secret key will end up in the bundle of your React Native application. So your env file in your React Native app is not a safe place for secret keys, for your Stripe secret key, for your OpenAI secret key, or whatever you might have. Now, the follow-up question is, where do I put this stuff? And I actually had a long discussion about this with my brother and ChatGPT. So we were kind of like 3 persons in that conversation. And he was also like, but where should I put them? So there are some storing mechanisms on iOS and Android where you can actually put them in a safe way. However, I don't really see the mechanism how this could work, because at some point you still have the key in your app and then you write it into that place. So to me, that's not really a good way. What ChatGPT and what I recommend is usually you have sort of a server. It could just be a proxy, And on the server, in a server side, in a real server side environment, you keep your variables that should be really safe. So your app makes a call against that API, and that API has the actual key and then makes the follow-up call. Now, this could also be exploited still, like triggering your API constantly with something. So you need to probably limit it to the origin of your app as allowed origins for HTTP calls to that proxy. That becomes a bit more challenging, but it's definitely something worth doing. An even better way is actually, or also possible now with Expo Router, an API route. So if you have an API route in your app, that would also be built and hosted somewhere in a safe environment. And in that API route, you could use something like an OpenAI secret key. The only thing you need to be aware of is that you don't put Expo public in front of the name of the variable in your env file, because then it will still show up somewhere else. If you leave that out, your API route will still be able to use it like a traditional env variable, and it is safe. I just had a video about this using fel.ai and Expo routes. That was kind of like the perfect showcase of how you can do it. So I hope this answers the question of where to put your secret keys. Now, Alan, what is your advice on integrating React Native into existing native applications? Well, the topic of brownfield applications is super exciting and it is super challenging. And I had just in the previous episode Marius Stanis on the podcast who did exactly this. He also gave a presentation at the App.js about brownfield integration. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in the brownfield topic, check out the previous podcast episode. Ennis wants to know. Ennis, by the way, is writing these great guides. I think he's also writing for Vadim's newsletter, but he's also doing his own stuff. He really has epic documents. Check out his social profiles and GitHub profile. What is the best choice for your React Native styling component? So I don't know exactly if I get the right question, because I also asked something similar recently on X. I was asking if I should use native wind and tailwind and that, or no, actually I asked about using style sheet in my videos, or if that is the best way. And Jamin from Infinite Red had some ideas about this, about using objects and how they do it in Ignite. We couldn't really find a full solution to the best way of styling our components. There are so many different ways, so many packages. For me, using style sheet is still okay, but if you want like style sheet on steroids, you probably want to use Unistyles. It is interesting because when I tried Unistyles the first time from Ejecting, it was more like, oh, this is kind of cool, this is new, this looks interesting. I wasn't really sure if this would take off, but at this point, Unistyles is like sitting at maybe 2K GitHub stars, and many people, whenever I asked about it, are saying, yeah, use Unistyles. I've used Unistyles. It's really great. It has almost the same API with a style sheet, but it brings in a tons of improvement in terms of like responsive features and variables and whatnot. So maybe Unistyles is really the best like solution to not go too far away from the inbuilt style sheet API. So it's kind of similar, but has more power, and it's not as far off as like using Tailwind for styling React Native apps. So maybe my recommendation and maybe my use in the future could be Unistyles. Cliff, React Native community CLI versus Expo. CLI is free and Expo is paid. So where do I begin? This is not correct. Expo is not paid. Expo and using Expo is the same as using the React Native community CLI. I haven't paid anything for this. The only thing that is paid is the Expo application services, EAS, and even those you can use partially for free. So the whole question starts like on a wrong premise here, because this is not the fundamental difference between the React Native community CLI and using Expo for your project. But nonetheless, I would still recommend for all new projects to use Expo. Basically, every company that I know is using Expo, is transitioning to Expo, uses Expo, will use it for future projects, and there's really not a whole lot of, like, I don't know why you should use the React Native community CLI. It's sometimes used, I know some people use it to quickly spin up projects, and maybe they don't need what Expo offers, and they feel better that way, but Honestly, I feel 100% freedom and I use Expo and there's like no limitation to me. Okay, then we have Tim, iOS 18 and Android major releases. How can we, what's the fastest way to implement native modules, ejecting, etc. Many prefer to avoid ejecting from Expo, but also strongly desire to be cutting edge even at time Expo can't keep up. Okay, a lot in here to unpack. First of all, what's the fastest way to implement native modules? I think actually the Expo Modules API is probably the fastest and easiest way. Not the fastest in terms of benchmarking, but the fastest in terms of developer experience, how you can build a native module. Then we also got Turbo Modules, which is the way to build modules from Meta. And the latest thing is Nitro Modules, which Mark Rosavi and the team at Magello came up with, which is probably the fastest way, like in terms of benchmarks now. However, for the regular developer, Expo Modules API is pretty great, and there was recently a nice live stream where they uncovered some pretty cool gems inside of the Expo Modules API. Check that out. I think it was, I can't exactly know, I don't know who did it, but check it out on YouTube on the Expo channel. Now, in terms of ejecting, I haven't heard that word for a long time, so it's interesting to hear it once again at the end of 2024. There is no more ejecting with Expo, and there hasn't been ejecting for at least a couple of years at this point. I think so, at least it feels to me like that. So if you have an Expo project, in the past you had to eject if you wanted to use custom native modules. So then you were leaving the Expo world, the comfort of the Expo world, and everything got challenging, and ejecting messed up your whole project. But at this point, if you want to use sort of native module that's not included in the default Expo modules, you just do a pre-build, which basically means you run a command, and based on your app.json, your configuration, Expo will generate an iOS and an Android project, and it will just integrate the native module. There's nothing you have to do or to worry about. There's no ejecting or anything like that. So please, I don't know if we still see this in 2025. That's going to be interesting, but right now, there's only pre-build, and I have a video on YouTube about all the ways how you can build your Expo app. You can build it from the CLI, you can build it with EAS, you can even build it through Xcode and Android Studio if you're a native developer and feel good about that. So yeah, I think that should be everything about ejecting. I don't think the question comes up again here. Okay, Fiki, at least I hope that's the name. It was like Indonesian letters, and I did a translation, so I'm sorry if this is wrong, but this was also like your X handle. How to reduce app's size, because my app size, either iOS or Android, is up to 110 megabytes. My recommendation is usually this sort of app size is not done by React Native or by Expo. And there was recently a great tweet that showcased like Expo versus React Native community CLI, and like the standard Expo application was like 4 megabytes. So the difference between 4 and 110 megabytes is quite a lot. And this is not due to like 50 TypeScript files. 50 TypeScript files won't be like 100 megabyte. So usually what's blowing up your files is like including big images. So make sure you resize them accordingly for native devices. If you have movies in your application or any other kind like initial database files, all these things can completely blow up your bundle size. Now, if none of these things is true, then maybe you're using a lot, and I think really many libraries you would need to get to 110 megabytes. But there's a cool tool from Expo called Atlas, which can inspect your bundle size. So go check that out. You can simply install it and run it with your app, and then you get like these cool boxes that show like the different sizes of the libraries and things in your application. You're gonna pretty quickly see how big your application is and where the biggest savings could be made. All right, Roberto, how can EAS update be involved in the design and QA review process when multiple engineers are working on various features? How can we maintain efficiency in this workflow? And then what is the best way to use Expo and EAS services with a large team of engineers, ensuring that we pass our features to the QA and design teams effectively? Now, I think the overall question is how you can use EAS and EAS updates in the best way if you're not a team of, say, 3 or 5 people, but actually a really big team. Now, there are multiple ways. First, You could use the official applications like iOS Test Flight, and for Android you got the alpha and beta track for testing, and then you could release these to your users and test them. But usually that's quite challenging in terms of the setups and like doing new builds of your application. So what you want to do is, if you want to keep this internal, I would do internal distribution through EAS. That's pretty easily done. Whenever you do an EAS build, you can share the URL of that build. And you can just go to your dashboard inside EAS and copy for one of the last builds the URL. You just need to make sure that all your devices of like the QA team and other people are included. But then if they install it through that link or they have the dev build, it's pretty easy. So, I mean, that's a tiny difference. They might have to install the dev build once, and then you can use EAS updates. And if you use EAS updates, you can define different channels. So you might have like these testing channel or preview channel, and then whenever you push out your code or do something, you could run an EAS update with a specific channel name. And so the person that's using the app for that specific channel is getting those updates. On top of that, you can, of course, also automate that stuff. So if you're using GitHub, for example, you could use GitHub Actions, and whenever you merge a pull request, or even if you do a commit, you can do, or you can trigger a new build within EAS, and you can automatically release this through EAS updates through the right channels, or even publish it to the App Store. So there are many ways how you can get the right apps to the right people in your organization. And finally, I highly recommend you also check out Expo Orbit, which is a pretty cool tool. They announced, I don't know, was it the last SDK or something? But anyway, I've installed it as well. With Expo Orbit, you can open up your different simulators and devices, but as a team, you can also just select from a drop-down a specific build and will be deployed to one of your devices. So this is like the fastest way to check out one of the PRs of your team and have it right in your device. I hope that answers the question. There's of course going on a lot in terms of EAS and what you can do. I'm probably not the best to explain it, although I hope this gave you an idea of what you can do, but feel free to reach out to the Expo team. They are always super helpful in terms of EAS and what's possible. Talon asks, what is your go-to debugging tool or debugging method? My debugging method is usually console log. I'm honest here. We all do it, and I'm just honest. My debugging tool is, okay, I haven't been around long enough to feel really good about Flipper and these tools. They always felt quite slow on my Mac. So instead, I always try to rely on the debugging tools of the browser. And with Expo, I can just press J and it brings up the browser debugging tools. Since like 2 or 3 SDK versions, I can see my network traffic in there. I can do a whole lot of things with it. And usually that's my go-to debugging method right now. Alternatives? Well, you could use the Radon IDE, which was really called React Native IDE, which is an interesting new project. It has like little replays, and I think you can do breakpoints and all that cool thing. I should really check out Radon again. Let me know if you're interested in that. But overall, I'm just looking forward to the next version of the DevTools, because with React Native 0.76, they announced they have revamped the DevTools. I'm really looking forward to what they came up with. I haven't checked out the RSC so far because we're now in October and release should happen in October, I think. So I'm really curious to see what those DevTools will be about. I know that Expo was also constantly working on this and improving the debugging experience, because overall the last surveys in the last 2-3 years, debugging was usually at the #1 frustration for all developers. So I think both Matter and Expo are well aware of the fact that debugging is too complicated, and maybe it's now finally getting better. Assad asked actually 2 questions. First one, how can we achieve performance like Flutter apps with Expo? Okay, cool. We have one Flutter question here. I think, honestly, once the new architecture is the default, and actually I think it's the default by now for all new apps, React Native apps should have the same performance as Flutter applications. There's just like a tiny gap in between, and React Native is really catching up with the new architecture and probably even more in the future with static RMS. And I don't know how much it changes. It will change the startup time of your application, but I'm not sure how it really affects like the runtime of your application and the performance then. On top of that, there are things like React Native Skia, so from William Condillan, who brought in Skia, which is the rendering engine in Flutter, so you can also use this in a performant way at the same level inside a React Native application if you want to use Skia. And then, of course, also all the things William is currently doing with 3D. What was the project called? I just did a video on it. Of course, I forgot about it, but there's a lot going on in terms of the 3D space. Let me quickly look this up. The video was called Why React Native 3D Doesn't Suck Anymore. It was about WebGPU. That's what it was called. So WebGPU and using the WebGPU API in React Native app is also allowing us to do really, really performant things in our application. So I really don't think that the performance Flutter versus Expo is a big criteria. I did a review of different really practical things regarding React Native versus Flutter a couple of months ago. And you need to understand that most applications don't really struggle with performance. They might on some older Android devices, but most businesses won't be limited by the performance of React Native. So this argument that Flutter is always faster because it's so fast and bytecode and whatever, it's not really applicable in most scenarios for most companies on this planet. So therefore, I don't think the performance really matters that much. And at the same time, we in the React Native land are pretty close to catching up with Flutter with the new architecture and the things coming up. Question 2 by Assad is, which styling library is best for Android plus iOS plus web combination? Now, this is a different framing of the styling solution question we previously had from Anis. This is directly about like cross-platform solutions, so Android, iOS, web. In this case, you still can use Unistyles because it has like responsive stuff built into it. However, I think in this case, there are two libraries that really stand out at the moment. The one is Tamagui from Nate, which has been around for, I think, 1 or 2 years at this point. And people really like it. I found it a bit challenging to get started, but once you get into how Tamagui works, it's really cool. It's probably not a whole set of components, but it's like a lot of things. It's a compiler, it optimizes your CSS and your code, and it gives you a lot of features and functionality that will help you build really great cross-platform applications that work native and web mostly the same. Gonna come back to Tamagui as well in a second. The second option I would see here is Native Wind. So Native Wind brings Tailwind CSS to React Native, and we can then use it for both web and native. However, at this point, Native Wind is still not in version 4, so it sits at version 2. There was a problem with version 3, but they're constantly working on version 4, so I hope with version 4 we've eliminated most of the basic problems and then can call Native Wind definitely a great solution for React Native apps as well. Oliver, what's your opinion on React Native going to stretch with React DOM and web-based APIs? This is an interesting point of view. It's kind of like, is React Native watering down its USP by adding all these web-based things? That's at least that's what I read in this question. So basically, should React Native stay more native? That's a really tough one. I think my answer to this is no, because time is changing. So if React Native wants to stay a relevant framework, then it just has to adapt that or understand and accept that people want to build for all platforms. I mean, we wanted to do cross-platform apps for like the last 10 years at this point. We've done this with Ionic and Capacitor, with web-based platforms or Codebase. And you can do this, of course, also with Flutter, although Flutter for the web, it's a joke. But I think React Native just needs to go with the time and change a bit. So I think it's just natural that they explore new possibilities, and especially strict DOM. So from Matter, I did a video on this like a month ago where you can pretty much use like standard div or web components, and they will render to native components on iOS, and on the web you're gonna see a div. I actually think this might or should be the future, because we're doing crazy things with AI at this point, and we should definitely be able to just have like one syntax in which we define our views, and it should spit out the right view no matter which platform we run on. So on the web, just give me the right web stuff, and on iOS and Android, just give me the native counterparts. And with React Strict DOM, we've seen that it probably already works. So I really think this is going to be the future. If you would strictly say, oh, React Native should only be iOS and Android focused, you're losing out on tons of people. Not even talking about the people who want to build a Mac OS app or a Windows app. So yeah, I think it's good with this more web-based APIs and the universal approach. Sort of in the same manner, Rosario asked, do you think React Native will become in the near future a sort of React Universal, using one code base for all platform, mobile, web, desktop? I mean, a really one code base, not a separate package like React Native for Windows. Yeah, I think this is what is going to happen. Maybe it's even happening at Expo. Evan Bacon mentioned a couple of things when I talked to him last time, and I think they're cooking up something behind the scenes. So I truly believe that it's also the goal of Evan to have this universal React, and that React Native becomes this universal React, because coming from React Native, we have this focus on native. And things like Next.js can't do this. If they now try to embrace native as well, that just wouldn't work. However, with React Native, we come from a solid foundation of a native focus, and on top we can now also build a web output that's at the same level of tools like Remix and Next.js probably in the future, and then we could call this universal React. At the same time, I just did a video on One. So One is a new framework recently announced and released by Nate, also the creator of Tamagui. So Tamagui and One, also both from Nate. It is interesting, and an interesting approach to simplify web and mobile development, exactly in the words that Rosario used here, using one code base for all platforms. Now, you can basically do this with Expo Router at this point as well. You can have native layout routes, you can have web layout routes, you can have native or web-specific files and components. You can even use CSS with React Native, with Expo Router Web. So all of these things are kind of already possible with One. They're packaged together in a different way. One is using Vite, so it's pretty much just a Vite plugin. It's not using Metro. It's an interesting concept. From the code, it looks pretty much like Expo Router. It has file-based routing with type routes. It also uses loaders from Remix to load data or fetch data upfront from the server for your components, which might be possible in the future with React Native using React Native server components. So I don't know exactly where One is going. You can check it out if you're interested in this, because this is exactly the direction Nate is going to. And I mean, One in combination with Tamagui might be definitely a great choice for complete cross-platform applications. All right, Saurabh, how can we effectively use Expo for web and native platform? I tried, but it takes lots of efforts for styling same component in web. How can I make this easier? Yeah, I don't think you want to do this like manually. You don't want to use React Native Web and then try to style those things as if it was web. This is really not the way to go anymore in 2024 and beyond. I would really recommend you could either use Tamagui, which gives you great components and optimized web output, or you could use Expo Router and CSS on the web. No matter what you use, you're definitely going to be better off. You might even use Tailwind with Expo Router then, so don't try to like fake web components by implementing your own React Native style object for that. David, what skills would I need in the next 1, 3, 5 years to be a really good React Native developer? Well, David, I mean, you're a great React Native developer no matter what comes, but because you can ship things, right? You're the captain of shipping things. I think for the next 1 or 3 years, I would definitely make sure you understand what's going on in AI land. Get on a newsletter, just follow the stuff that goes on. Try things like Cursor, Claude, V0, Bolt.new. You don't have to incorporate all of them right now, but you definitely want to understand the tools that are available. Image generation tools, and especially how to write good prompts. Because this can be really helpful and make in the future the difference between a good developer and a really great developer. We all really don't know what's going on right now with AI. Will AI replace developers? Probably not, but if you're not making sure that you follow up with these trends, because this is not like Web3, the AI stuff has caught up a lot more and everyone's using it already. So even though you might have used it and you didn't get good results from Copilot, give it a try every other month and see how far and how fast it is evolving, because it's kind of mind-blowing. With Cursor, you can generate multiple files at once, you can generate test cases and all these things, and even if it's not figuring out really complex stuff, you can make the boring parts that sometimes take you 10 minutes in like 10 seconds. And if you do a couple of these every other day, you have already saved a couple of hours per week. So really, don't neglect AI. That was my first recommendation. On top of that, if you want to be a great React Native developer, I think you should understand what's going on with universal apps. You should really follow this trend closely, because everyone wants a web and a mobile app, and you should understand what's out there, what's possible, which tools you have available, and probably also as React Server components are coming to React Native, it makes sense to understand a bit more of the server side. So don't just focus on the client, but also understand what it means to have a React Server component. Where's the code running? What can I do? What are my possibilities? I think these are the elements that React Native developers need to understand in the upcoming 1 to 3 years. On top of that, in the next 5 years, honestly, I'm not sure if we still code like this in 5 years. I recently read a tweet which was basically saying that in the near future, writing code and developing like we currently do is becoming something like baking your own bread. Although I bake my own bread, it's actually fun. But it's more like a hobby, like a fun thing to do. And everyone will be using these AI tools. They spit out stuff, you improve them, you iterate on it. And that is the main thing of a developer maybe in 5 years already. And what we do, writing code and doing text align center, this is more like a fun thing you do on a Friday night when the kids and your wife are out and you want to have some fun. You bring up the code editor and code an HTML page without AI by hand. So maybe that's just a funny hobby you got to do in 5 years. I have absolutely no idea, because I think it's going to be interesting. Okay, Oliver, what do you think is the future of React Native in the cross-platform ecosystem? For that, we would have to consider the different options we have. We have React Native, we have Flutter, and then we have like somewhere Ionic Capacitor coming up, and maybe we have something like Tori, which is still quite a niche thing. So what is the future of React Native in this combination? I think, honestly, I mean, I'm teaching React Native, so I think it's the best thing. Otherwise, I would teach Flutter if I thought it was the best thing. However, I honestly believe that we as React Native developers are just suited best for the future, no matter what comes. So React has taken over the world and every company is using it, so it's quite easy to go for React Native anyway. Beyond that, React Native renders to actual native functionality. So no matter what Android and Apple are coming up with in terms of new components and ways to build your application, with React Native, we're gonna have quickly the ability to use these new components and to benefit from all the development that these companies do. While if you do Flutter, you have to wait until they Photoshop pixel perfect designs of the latest operating system and bring that into Flutter, and you're still not rendering to these components. And it's just really, I mean, React Native is not perfect. I just read the issue that Dan Abramov recently brought up, that in basic React Native text inputs, if you do really fast typing, the cursor jumps. Yeah, that is kind of embarrassing for such a mature technology. However, nothing is perfect, and I think React Native is way closer to being the perfect solution between developer speed and what the business really needs than all the other frameworks out there. Yes, there are cases where Unity shines for all the games out there. There might be cases where Flutter shines if you really need custom animations and custom design and no stock stuff in your application, but still for 90 to 95% of the applications that will be developed in the future, React Native will be the best choice, period. Last question, I think, from Ivan. What recent changes in the Expo SDK are you most excited about, and how do you see these improving developer experience? Oh, he asked about recent changes. So recent changes, I would probably reframe this to like the upcoming changes, because the Expo SDK 52 is pretty near. In terms of recent changes, I think I liked all the Expo router stuff, especially API routes. And so I'm also looking forward to what's coming up next. I remember when I had Evan on this podcast, he said there were like they had planned 3 major versions of Expo Router, and then it would become like its own thing, standalone next to Expo. It was kind of vague, and this has to be like 1 or 1.5 years ago. So I don't know exactly what's going on there. However, for the upcoming Expo SDK, I am personally looking forward to the first implementation of React Server components with React Native. Evan promised this. At least a beta version, and I'm super excited to get my hands on this and play around and see the possibilities. Then Expo DOM components. I did a video on this, you know, I do all the videos. I think I've said this a couple of times now. I mean, that's a good sign, so I covered a lot of topics in videos. But anyway, I did a video on Expo DOM components, which is a way to bring in your HTML version into your React Native app and combine it and spice it up with native functionality, which tremendously helps to gradually migrate your application to React Native. So to bring in a web view, maybe a form, maybe a page, and then spice it up, connect it to your React Native app so you can use native additional controls and functionalities within. And that will be part of Expo SDK 52 as well. Beyond that, I'm also looking forward to the future of React Strict DOM, because as I said, I think there has to be a way to build React Native universal applications, and it doesn't have to be the one framework, because it still looks very React Native how we do apps right now. I think there has to be a way, and React Strict DOM was a great initiative to this. And I'm also looking forward to all the different styling solutions. So what's happening with StyleX at Meta, how native Wind will be accepted in the mobile landscape. I think there are a couple of interesting topics coming up, and of course the improvements to debugging tools that will come with React Native 0.76. So I'm personally, as always, super excited about the future of React Native and all the things that will come up, and I will definitely cover all the latest and greatest what happens with the next React Native version and with the next Expo SDK version in a video or podcast very soon. So stay subscribed if you haven't done this before, both YouTube and here, so you won't miss out on the news. And of course, thank you so much for submitting all the questions. These weren't even all the questions, but I feel like the episode is long enough. You've heard me today long enough, so thanks for having me in your ears. I hope you have a great day, and if you have future questions, just leave a comment or send me a direct message. You can catch me currently on X and also LinkedIn. Thanks for joining today's episode. My goal is to share interesting stories and insights into the world of React Native development. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. And on Spotify and Apple, you can leave up to a 5-star review. Because podcasts, and especially niche podcasts like this, are hard to find, subscribing and leaving a review does help me a lot. On top of that, check out my React Native courses on galaxies.dev that cover a variety of topics from getting started to building and publishing your mobile app. Finally, you can share today's episode with a friend or colleague who would enjoy the topic of the show. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, find me on X or leave a comment on YouTube. And last but not least, thank you for listening and happy coding, Simon.